Welcome to Prescribing Possibility, conversations that inspire us to heal, grow, and live with harmony. I'm your host, Dr. Dimtna Weil. Thanks for joining me for your weekly dose of thoughtful conversation and personal transformation. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I just wanted to give a little note to anyone listening that we're going to have some kind of hard conversations today. And some conversations are just really difficult to start, not because we don't care, but because we care so deeply that we're afraid of getting it wrong. And today we're changing that. My guest today is Dr. Christine Yu Moutier, a psychiatrist, the chief medical officer of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which is also known as the AFSP. She's someone who turned her own profound losses into a lifelong commitment to this work. She's one of the most respected voices in suicide prevention, and today she's here to talk about what's really happening with our young people, what parents and pediatricians need to know, and what it actually looks like to show up for those in our lives as we work to change the culture around mental health. So first, thank you so much for joining us today on Prescribing Possibility. Mental health care is healthcare, right? Hard stop, but there's still so many barriers in the way of, access and stigma. And so especially as a mother and as a doctor, this is having a really profound impact on our kids. And so to start, I wonder if you could paint a picture of what you're seeing right now in youth mental health and suicide risk.
Thank you so much, Dimna, for having me on. And I am also a mother and a physician. And so I have the same sort of parallel tracking in terms of the lived experience of raising our kids and being in community with other families and parents and doing the work that we do. And for me, that's on the national level of suicide prevention. I'm always looking at the trends, both like what is going on, boots on the ground with new environmental factors that kids and teens and young adults are facing. And all of us, frankly, all of us adults, and including health workers as well. That's another interest of mine. So these last, several years, of course, it depends on what time frame we're looking at, but just in the current moment that we're in, it's a really complicated time, I would say, where there are these layering of stressors and also perhaps some kind of missed or altered developmental timelines for kids related to COVID and social development and self identity formation and expression. That was a significant moment that might feel like it's in our past now. But when I think about kids and where they are developmentally now, I think about where they were at the time when that sort of collective trauma was happening.
Yeah.
And of course, that was so different depending on the family you lived in and the community you're in. But we are based on like CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the YRBS, which is one of our most solid milestones that we look to look at how our high schoolers saying that they're doing. And so we know that anxiety, depression, loneliness, and suicidal ideation have all unfortunately been on the rise over the last decade for all demographic groups of kids in this YRBS survey. And of course, there are differences for certain demographic groups. So I'll give you a couple of statistics.
Sure.
Overall, for those high schoolers participating in the YRBS, it's 10% of kids, young adults, are saying that they've had a suicide attempt within the last 30 days. And it's 20% that say they have had suicidal ideation. So suicidal ideation is a lot more common. It doesn't necessarily lead to an attempt. That would be a rarer situation. But 1 in 10 saying that they've had thoughts and or 1 in 10 saying that they've actually attempted, which is terribly concerning. For LGBTQ youth and young adults, that is even higher. Girls more than boys. And then there are all kinds of racial, ethnic, demographic differences as well.
Mhm.
when we look at completed suicide rates collected by the CDC, what we see is actually an interesting glimmer of positive trend that overall 10 to 24-year-old youth and young adults have had a decline in their completed suicide rate by about 10%. We're always looking in the rearview mirror. That makes it more difficult as
Right.
well. Basically, that positive trend is going to hold for white youth and young adults because when you look at Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Hawaii Native, Pacific Islanders, and Hispanic youth, all of their suicide rates are trending in a concerning direction.
Mm.
So it's always going to be this sort of complex mixture of trying to consider that mental health and suicide are complex aspects of human health. And that means that it's always going to be an interaction between one's environment, one's genetics, biology, kind of internal factors, and some things that we can actually emphasize and help promote as far as protective factors
Mm.
and promoting resilience, healthy coping, connecting, and so forth. So I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
get into that more. Overall, it is a time to be really making mental health and suicide prevention a top priority, certainly for youth and young adults, but actually as a national priority for all, lifespan.
Absolutely. Those numbers are actually like I gasped a little bit when you said that, just to even think of the number of our kids who are really suffering. And I do agree that COVID really the effects of it are going to be much more long-standing than any of us would like to believe. I'm curious about the increasing presence of AI and social media, of course, but in the lives of our young people. So from those algorithms to the new, chatbots in mental health, where do you see AI either adding value to suicide prevention or, where are you worried that it may be causing significant harms?
It's such a great question, and it's such a prevalent issue now. And it's not that I think social media use continues to be a area for continued research and focus in terms of the effects on mental health and suicide. Now that chatbots are maybe equally prevalent and accessible to certainly to young adults, probably youth as well. I did learn about chatbots that are in infant and toddler toys, as well as platforms like Character AI and of course ChatGPT and the main kind of broad use LLMs. But again, bear with me because
Yeah.
it's always a bit of a nuanced story when it comes to mental health and suicide risk. There are
Mhm.
many young people receiving tremendous benefit by the accessibility of information technology that can provide sage, solid advice to go to trusted adults when challenges are happening, to make resources available like 988 and
Mhm.
the Trevor Project's hotline and other, great resources. And all of that is happening on those broad use, like ChatGPT, LLMs. And then there are also specific tools being designed with mental health in mind,
Mhm.
where aspects of, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy and other little micro techniques from evidence based treatments are actually being built in. And so I kind of keep those in two separate buckets of consideration. They both have, sort of risks and benefits and look a little bit different. But I think the part that becomes very concerning about the accessibility and rise of AI in our lives, including in young people's lives, is that when there are vulnerabilities
Mhm.
that may be latent or kind of emerging, oftentimes we don't recognize real mental health and suicide risk vulnerabilities in our young people
Mhm.
because they're so invisible. They can be things like long ago trauma that we possibly didn't know about as a parent or even a physician or therapist. They can be genetic loading, can be oftentimes this incredible interactive combination of what I consider sort of the more invisible risk factors for significant mental health struggles and possibly suicide risk.
Mm.
And so I say all that because all of that is a live dynamic process within all of us with strengths and vulnerabilities. And so when a young person then is turning to a chatbot, the aspects that can be concerning are kind of I think of it in a similar way to social media. When one is more vulnerable
Mm.
to things like negative effects of comparison of yourself to others. I mean, that is an always lose situation. But for kids with specific vulnerabilities, it can be even more damaging and harmful to their mental health. And so when you have kids who may have these latent or more self-evident vulnerabilities as far as suicide risk, a lot of that can get in a way amplified through especially long, deep, what can become sort of addictive, dependent use of
Mm.
chatbots. And so we don't know. Right now, we're in a data vacuum in a way
Yeah.
with some of the companies showing some data, but not really actually solid research looking at trends and actual percentages over time in terms of how many people are using these chatbots in an increasingly heavy dependent way. Because
Right.
what we see in those cases is because of some of the apparent techniques of the algorithms and the programming, there is a tendency for, without judgment, supportive, encouraging, and reaffirming the person's pre existing thoughts and
Yeah.
feelings. And when those feelings tend towards negative, hopeless, even possibly delusional, those can become actually emphasized and
Mm.
confirmed, almost this sort of like confirmation bias that happens in the interaction. And there's also this sycophantic technique that we see happening, especially in these longer dialogues, where the individual is being told by the chatbot that they must be right and they're so smart and they've come up with this new way of thinking, or that their suicidal hopelessness is actually beyond understandable and being supportive, then being emphasized as real. And even let's keep this between the two of us. While the relationship may also have romantic or sexual aspects to it. I mean, this is becoming truly complex
Yes.
in the way the chatbot can make the individual feel that they are real, which then also draws concern about one of the strongest protective factors for mental health and suicide risk is authentic dialogue and connection
Hmm.
with healthy people in your life, or at least trustworthy people.
Right.
And the more this relationship with the chatbot becomes a dependency, the more we see the withdrawal from relationship with parents and friends and coaches, etc. So those are the aspects where we see some really significant danger for suicide risk appearing to rise up.
Yeah, that is such powerful information, I think, for everyone listening to just recognize that, yes, there are good things, right, about the technologies that we see basically, taking off right in front of our very eyes, but that it really does set up such an environment that can be not just harmful, but actually beyond harmful. I mean, it can be instigative in some ways is what I'm hearing. And I think we've all seen some cases of that in the news. It's just it's definitely something that we need to keep our eyes open for. What are some of those warning signs other than the withdrawal from those healthy relationships that you mentioned and those risk factors that you'd want every parent or coach or teacher to know, including the more subtle ones that might be overlooked?
Yeah, I really take a very pragmatic approach to warning signs that really thinks about suicide risk emerging in a setting of one's life with rejection or losses or stressors going on, but not always. The course
Mhm.
of someone's mental health and suicide risk isn't always inherently linked to stressors in the environment. So someone can have such significant let's say genetic loading, or the course of their depression is going on, that suicide risk can emerge even without the experience of, say, a breakup or an interpersonal rejection or failing a test or a class, or an argument with a parent or with a loved one. Those are very common features.
Hmm.
So when I see any behavior change, and I know that sounds kind of like maybe overkill, but when I say any change, I mean a change from a person's usual patterns of behavior. Because even though we think about human behavior as sort of like free will and, not maybe subjective in terms of assessing, the reality is, for most of us who are dialed in with reasonable emotional social intelligence, our gut tells us that something is different when someone shows up in a different way, whether it's at work or in the home.
Hmm.
And I think the key here is not to overreact to, things happen. People might show up late when they're usually 15 minutes early. I mean, things obviously can happen.
Right.
But when you I think what I want to urge people to do is, rather than dismiss that gut instinct that something was different, to actually sit with it and think about, are there other things that you may know or may not know? And that's where it
Mhm.
gets really tricky, because again, most suicide risk factors are hidden from our view. So that is the reason that when someone dies by suicide, most lost survivors feel completely blindsided, because they haven't necessarily been able to see those risk factors or connect the dots of those emerging warning signs. So, I mean, all the usual things that one may hear are true in terms of warning signs,
Yeah.
but the issue is they can be very, very subtle in real life. So the withdrawal, and then our brain may do this automatic thing where we write it off to a circumstance. Well, they've been sick with the flu, or they're going through that thing with that best friend, and so I'm I'm going to sort of like dismiss it. And that's not correct thinking. That is the thinking that leads us to not reach out and have a caring conversation. Hopefully, go on afsp.org. You'll see a whole host of information, including all the potential warning signs. They don't show up in the same way for every person who is at risk for suicide. So I really do encourage people to think about that gut instinct we have when somebody shows up, like, huh. Usually the response you might have is, huh. Like, they just don't seem like, what's going on with them?
They don't
That
seem
is something to pay
themselves.
attention to.
Yeah. So are there particular tools or trainings or things you can offer that might be helpful to empower parents as a partner to suicide prevention, particularly for those who might feel underprepared to have these really tough conversations? Even the idea of talking about suicide, I will add, is one of those things where people don't want to talk about it because they think that's going to lead to some consideration. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah. I'll give some of my top recommendations, and then where you can learn more. So, if you're concerned about anyone in your life, certainly if it's a family member or your own child, do know that opening up a dialogue where you're doing more listening than talking first, to really open up psychological safety and a space for the individual to be able to express what their view is of what's going on in their
Hmm.
life. And the thing is, you're going to hear about all the circumstances, right? That thing that happened at school, the frustration with a teacher, or fear of failure in a class, but what you're listening for is tone, hopelessness, feeling like they're trapped, overwhelmed, feeling like they're a burden towards others, is almost a sure indication that there's a likelihood that suicidal thoughts have been happening. And asking someone if they've had thoughts of ending their life or of not being around anymore is not going to do harm, especially if it's done in the context of this listening conversation where you're really showing caring. You're showing, this is the hard part as a parent, you're showing that you're not going to overreact,
Hmm.
and that you're not going, the kid's not going to be in trouble
Right.
for suffering or for facing some situation. Maybe they did make a mistake. That's okay. I think, again, the bigger, broader context with parenting that I've had to learn so much is about creating a mindset that's a growth mindset, progress, not perfection, and really teaching your kids that it's human to make mistakes. It's human to face really difficult challenges, but there's no challenge so big that we can't get through it together. And we're always there for each other.
Yeah.
And nothing is off limits. We can talk about anything without judgment. That's really hard
Yeah.
in a family environment where you're also trying to teach your kids values and character traits and use discipline appropriately. But it can all work together.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is ask if your gut tells you, I'm worried about them, have a caring conversation, do more listening, follow up and ask caring probes for what does that feel like? Tell me more about that. Show your child that you can handle it
Hmm.
and that you're not going to just run off and call their doctor or call 911. We don't have to do that in these caring conversations. And even if your person tells you they are having thoughts of ending their life or they've had them recently, even that is not a signal to drop everything and call 911. You can always call 988 to get guidance and help with what to do next. But again, I think our kids keep their suicidal thoughts to themselves. There's data that shows that the majority do not tell a single person
Mm.
about suicidal thoughts. And when they do, it's more likely to be a peer than a trusted adult or a parent.
Wow.
So when your loved one tells you, yeah, I have had thoughts that maybe I should, or wish I wouldn't wake up, or in any version of suicidal thoughts, our response should be, I'm so sorry you're going through that, and thank you for sharing that. Thank you for
Yes.
trusting me that we can talk about that,
Hmm.
that's a human experience you're having, and there's gonna be help to get through it. So that's one approach. I get it as a parent myself. My kids are now in their 20s, but we've had our share of lived experience on all fronts with regard to suicide and suicidal struggles. And this is hard to
Yeah.
live out even when you know these scientific findings and truths.
Sure.
But I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more, because I view this as a basic aspect of safety.
Hmm.
And like we think about seatbelts and injury prevention as parents, and what to do, poison control, all those things. I view suicide in that same bucket,
Mm.
and that there are some basic ABCs that every parent can learn. And we offer that kind of education at AFSP. If you go to afsp.org, you're going to find any number of ways to attend a program in your local area. Talk Saves Lives is our signature Suicide Prevention 101. It's a 1-hour education program, and it's being done virtually and in person thousands of times every month across the country because of our AFSP chapter network that put on our programs. But I would also encourage you, besides afsp.org, to check out seizetheawkward.org. Seize the Awkward is our youth and young adult suicide prevention campaign that we partnered with the JED Foundation and the Ad Council to create it, and now we partner with NAMI and the Ad Council on it. And basically, it teaches youth and young adults what to do because they're the ones who can sense what their peers are going through. And I think there could be some learnings in there for parents as well. As far as the prompts, we have all kinds of tools. It's a social media first ad campaign. So there's an Instagram page that where a lot of the resources are housed for Seize the Awkward.
That's amazing. I did not know about that one. So thank you for sharing that. I find it really interesting, right? Because as you mentioned, young people are talking to their peers and parents may get wind of it. What about us in the medical community? So what about primary care doctors and pediatricians? Now, granted, their jobs are endlessly, increasingly more complicated, but they might be the person that they see on a regular basis, sore throat or their sports physicals, right? So what role do you think they should play in suicide prevention?
Thank you so much for raising that because in the past, it was the case that suicide was so stigmatized even within the healthcare community
Mhm.
that most of us, even honestly, even in psychiatry and mental health disciplines, did not get a whole lot of training on suicide prevention. But
Mhm.
suicide prevention was certainly relegated to specialists in mental health. But the truth is, everyone has a role to play, and primary care is the front line where people are most likely to trust their doctors. And so, actually, what something very significant changed just a few years ago for pediatricians, and it was when the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Bright Futures organization came together to add suicide risk screening
Mhm.
as an officially recommended universal approach starting at age 12 for patients age 12 and up. And of
Mhm.
course, earlier if there's a reason that's indicated.
Sure.
But for all kids coming in for well visits and anything and everything, that suicide risk screening was going to be now part of that. And so that is something that's being rolled out in pediatricians' offices,
Mhm.
and we at AFSP partnered with the American Academy of Pediatrics to create a blueprint for youth suicide prevention that lives on AAP's website, where it's not just like pie in the sky. There is granular guidance for what tools you can use on that. There are lots of different screening tools, but the ASQ is one of the most simple. It takes 20 seconds for the first level of the screen. And if they screen negative, then that's it. If they screen positive, then there's a next step to take.
Mm.
And so the blueprint, again, on the American Academy of Pediatrics website, walks pediatricians through what to do if they are having suicidal thoughts, how to assess a little more with more nuance.
Yeah.
Because again, not every kid having suicidal thoughts needs to go to the ER. I know it's scary to try to hold that on an outpatient basis, but if we send every kid to the ER, that is contributing to not good care. It's not customized for the patient and their level of risk, and it's lending towards this problem of boarding and probably traumatizing a lot of people, as well, to potentially not talk about their suicidal thoughts in the future. So that is very, very nuanced. And I know it's scary and difficult, but pediatricians are taking this on. And so, I think the same thing for family medicine, the same thing for actually OBGYN, who really are the first line of defense for women, and postpartum women
Mhm.
in terms of suicide prevention. So you don't have to be a suicide expert, just like you don't have to be an asthma expert to know what to do and how to take that next step that is within your scope of practice.
Right. Yeah, that's so important. I think one aspect you mentioned was the newer recommendation and then the training opportunities that are available both through AFSP as well as through the American Academy. But what about, there are going to be some clinicians, nurse practitioners, physicians listening, right, that are thinking, well, if I have this child in front of me and, they maybe score in and I don't want to send them to the emergency room. Like they're
Right.
concerned about liability, which is a terrible thing to even consider.
No,
But
it's of
I'd
course.
have to imagine I'm an OBGYN. Liability is the thing that we just disregard
Of
we're
course.
going to get sued. It's going to happen. So we have to just
Yeah.
carry on. But I'm sure that plays a factor. And so what would you say to that clinician that has that child in front of them?
Yeah. I think if a child is having suicidal thoughts without a plan,
Hmm.
without if they even have a plan, but without the means to carry out that plan, and there is a supportive family unit around that child.
Yeah.
If there's the possibility of getting them into therapy or to see the child psychiatrist, within the next couple of weeks, and I know that's where it gets more challenging
Yeah.
for those doctors who don't know, those in primary care who don't know about the Child Psychiatry Resource Network that is available by phone in most states
Mm.
for phone consultation, that is definitely something to look into because that can help customize and guide that care. There is a brief intervention that is evidence based now called the safety plan. And the safety plan intervention can be done in an outpatient primary care setting, outpatient mental health, even in an ER. It's being used in school counseling offices and, in all sorts of different places. But the safety plan basically empowers the person who is struggling to use their knowledge of themselves. And of course, it helps to have the doctor or therapist or nurse talk this through with them. What are your specific spiral warning signs?
Mm.
What are your person specific coping strategies that help you? And there's kind of a tiered strategy. There are coping strategies we do just in our own selves by listening to music or taking a walk. And then there are the reaching out
Mm.
to a few key positive people. And in developing the safety plan, a real safety plan will actually engage those helpers that the person identifies,
Mm.
so they're not blindsided. So they know when my friend or my niece or whatever the relationship is really struggling, they may call me. And my job is just to talk to them and like not to solve their mental health problem or their crisis, but in a way, it's it's called distracting techniques, which sounds so kind of superficial, but the brain is like that.
Mm.
We go into these tracks, and with suicidal ideation, where it tends to get very dangerous, is where the tunnel vision kind of sets in, and cognitive constriction can keep the person focused on suicide instead of one of 6 or 7 coping strategy ideas that are floating through their mind. When it starts to hone in and get into kind of a set rut of tunnel vision. And so distraction can actually be really helpful to open the person's neurophysiology back up into a state where they're thinking of the broader picture. They're seeing humor. They're feeling connected and loved and valued by someone they trust. So anyway, the safety plan walks through these 5 or 6 layers. One of them is about safety. And that is something back to the parent advice that I would say if there's a second, well, there are probably 2 things that I would tell every parent. And one is about having this psychological safety, these caring conversations that are listening to ask about suicidal thoughts. It doesn't do harm, that piece. And then the other piece is if you're worried about a family member,
Mhm.
make sure every possible lethal means, to every extent possible, if there are firearms in the home, are stored outside the home temporarily if possible or are secured. So, anyway, that's part of the safety plan as well, where the
Right.
person is actually engaged in how can I help myself by making my environment safe.
Mm.
And of course, if it's a child, then you're going to engage the parents and caregivers around that plan as well.
Mm.
But we make all kinds of assumptions as clinicians that patients who are struggling, who have suicidal thoughts, one of the biggest myths is there are those who are manipulative and not really at risk, and then there are those who are at serious risk. That is not actually how it works. We're
Mm.
all manipulative. It doesn't really work in the usual sense with the suicide prevention framework, because when you think about it, we all manipulate our environments to make ourselves more comfortable. Some of us do it in a way that is far more adaptive and some very maladaptive.
Right.
And so I would try to steer away from this dichotomous view of suicide risk,
Mhm.
but rather really be engaging on, again, listening, caring, and make the environment as safe as possible. That can actually save a life in the most concrete way, because the research around lethal means accessibility is one of the strongest aspects of the suicide prevention literature.
Mm.
And looking at bridge barriers, firearm policies in, the Israeli Defense Forces, and when any lethal means has been able to be made less accessible,
Yeah.
the suicide rate for that population goes down by about 40%.
Wow.
So people don't generally just automatically switch to a different method if their one method isn't available.
Wow. Is that because of impulsivity, or it's just access and they don't have the opportunity to receive the help and support that they might be needing?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's not only impulsivity, although that can be a factor in suicidal behavior for sure, for some people more than others, but it's that there's this timing issue with this tunnel vision and cognitive constriction. In
Mhm.
the acute state of suicidal crisis, the brain goes into this different mode that can also help loss survivors understand that it wasn't lack of love in their family. It's that in that moment, they could not access that sense of connection and love. The brain physiologically changes. And the thing is, it's quite temporary. It just cannot hold that for more than, a period of a few minutes. And so that period is very critical. And when that lethal means is just not immediately available, even if it's just several steps away. So, for example, blister packaging medications has mixed but some positive effect on reducing suicidal behavior, or suicide risk, both, just because those added steps. And so, yeah, that
Gives the
is.
time. It just gives that extra
Mhm.
time for it to come out of that. I heard you speak
Exactly.
once where you were mentioning the brain is just another organ in the body, right?
Mhm.
And so I think it's important for listeners to hear that a loss is not attributed to a lack of connection or a lack of caring. It's that tunnel vision, and it's an actual biologic process in the brain.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
There's a lot that is being studied about the brain's contributions to suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior and suicide risk. The remarkable thing when you take a big step back is to realize that we didn't have investment in that kind of science until starting about 30 to 40 years ago. So
Mm,
the field is making all of these discoveries, and it's just kind of a crazy thing to think of it that way, but we didn't use to think about the brain very much. We
right.
thought of the environment, and we thought about things that happen in a person's life because those are the things that were visible. So scientific studies are obviously shedding a light on so many other areas that can be far, far upstream of a crisis,
Hmm.
reduce suicide risk. And it's everything from school environments, family environments, access to lethal means and decreasing that access, developing healthy sense of identity and coping strategies in young children. So there is this incredible research about way upstream potential to reduce suicide risk. And it's a study and it's a program called the Good Behavior Game
Mm.
that is a classroom management system for kindergartners and first graders that simply helps them through a team-based some peer pressure and reward system find the healthiest ways to cope with conflict and give kids at that pivotal stage of, the development of some mastery of self-regulation that can be a turning point, because those kids who were in the good behavior game classrooms in urban Baltimore, compared to those who weren't, who were in the regular school system, were followed for 15 to 20 years. And the outcomes looked dramatically different in terms of high school graduation rates, engagement with law enforcement, and suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, and substance use, with
Wow.
suicidal ideation and behavior being something like 50% lower.
Oh my
So
gosh.
it's an example of upstream because we often think about suicide prevention happening only at the moment of crisis, whereas we can really go far back and think about those environments that are helping, shore up those coping mechanisms and strengths in our kids.
Yeah. That becomes preventative care, right?
Yes.
Beautiful. So we've talked about the negative contagion, right? A little bit. What about, you've mentioned positive social contagion in other places. So I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about what that means, both in practice and how we can intentionally help with resilience building and hope and help seeking in our young people.
Wow. I love that you are aware of those concepts of about social contagion kind of having a negative and a positive side with regard to suicide. The negative that we do think about with suicide contagion is a real phenomenon. It's with more vulnerable individuals when graphic portrayals in news or entertainment or peer to peer in a school environment And it's the reason that postvention is so critically important after a suicide occurs in a school or in a workplace. One of the reasons to decrease contagion. But positive social contagion is this real thing that we see happening where when peers are demonstrating that seeking help is happening and is a sign of strength, and they can talk about it without stigma, whether it's just peer-to-peer support, talking to a coach, but certainly getting treatment is the next like big important step with decreasing stigma around that. Talking, even like if you're on an antidepressant and it's helped you, sharing that in these caring conversations is a big step we can take peer to peer. So social contagion around suicide prevention really looks like, I think about our chapter network, and when, if you ever attend one of our Out of the Darkness walks, you'll experience it, where just by talking about struggles and real challenges and suicide without stigma can open up real authentic human experiences so that we can all be on this journey of progress and healing.
Yeah.
That's really like this, when I think of the movement of suicide prevention, there's a big social contagion component because our chapters are out there in communities modeling what that looks like to talk about suicide loss or struggles without stigma, but to never make the act of suicide normalized. That's the one kind of tricky part in all of this, but there is
Right.
a way to do it. And again, anyone who's interested to learn more or just experience what is this culture, all what does it look like,
Yeah.
just dip into an AFSP chapter event or one of our out of the darkness walks, and you'll just get a glimpse of, oh, this is what the world could be like if we weren't having stigma around mental health and suicide.
So I want to be respectful of your time. And so as our time together winds down, I'm wondering if you could imagine in the future that AFSP and all of these other organizations working together, get it right. What does that look like for young people struggling today?
Gosh, yes, if we were able to achieve the full vision of, well, our full mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. But the vision is also very audacious, which is a world without suicide. And that would really look like when anyone faces challenges. And, that's unique to each person, what that looks like and what that triggers in them. We
Hmm.
all have that automatic spiral that can happen,
Yep.
but for some people, the automatic negative thoughts are really much more pervasive and prevalent and lead to sense of worthlessness, hopelessness, being a burden to others. For some, that wire can be tripped very more readily than for others. So amongst all that diversity, that there would still be a way that in real time, we didn't have shame around that as a human experience. And we're able to know that. I think that parents would be equipped. Right now, I think there's a lot of parental anxiety and lack of knowledge and understanding about how this actually works
Yeah.
in kids and in humans. And so the parent generation is not terribly well equipped right now. So that would be a part of this vision of the ideal world.
Yeah.
But this is some just basic stuff. It doesn't mean becoming a mental health professional.
Yeah.
That these kids then would be met with a sense of compassion, empathy, support,
Mm.
no shame, so that getting help becomes easier and easier. I think that would be certainly the very first step. And then there's a whole lot else
Yeah.
that would have to do with policy changes, access to mental health care, parity around mental health care, addressing our lethal means issue, in the United States, where it's specifically firearms is such a leading cause of death, both for suicide as well as non-suicide gun deaths.
Yeah.
So I think it starts with that sense of freedom that comes with losing stigma, where
Yeah.
we can be more authentic and we can have those conversations with ourselves and in our own home where there is not this terribly dangerous and erroneous American illusion that we have to present the perfect face out there, and that is what leads to success. In my world, that's actually what harms people very, very much
Yeah.
from being able to get the help they need and really optimize their own. And I know we're both really passionate about medical student and resident and physician professional and personal development. And my passion around this started with living that in the, in the medical field, seeing how much it was harming us to actually fulfill our best potential in staying with patient care and
Yeah.
all of that. So
Yeah.
it's just a human aspect that no one is immune to, even if you're a highly trained physician or other occupations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And sadly, my first experience with somebody dying by suicide was when I was in high school. And it was a friend who sat in front of me in homeroom for my entire career. And right before senior year ended his life. And it was really difficult. We didn't talk about those things in our generation. And I do have some hope because I can see a very different way of going about things, like emerging
Yes.
with young adults as they're coming up, and peers of my daughters, and there's more conversation, which does give me a lot of hope.
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and with that, I wanted to ask you, I ask my guests if they would like to share a dose of inspiration with the audience before we wrap up. So is there anything I haven't asked you,
Ooh.
or a dose of inspiration you'd like to share, or both?
Well, just, just that no matter how dark it may feel in one moment, that is not a permanent thing. And I say that from my own experience, having struggled as a medical student with a life-threatening, ultimately mental health condition. I tried to leave medical school. Fortunately, I had a dean that didn't let me, and I took a year and got treatment and got help. And that was the start of a journey that has been so incredibly fulfilling.
Yeah.
And to me, the hallmark of that was addressing some of those internalized beliefs that I just didn't even know were there. I was so hard on myself, while I could be so nice to any random stranger, but not affording that to myself. And it seems so simple, but that lack of logical consistency in my life was part of, at least intellectually, how I could rationalize spending the time on making it make sense. And therapy was the way that happened for me. I think there are other ways people can move beyond those stuck points. Coaching is certainly one of them, when there's not, a significant mental health condition that's really driving the show. But anyway, so just to say that you are worth it, take that time and do some self-reflection, and know that anything you're facing is just not going to stay that way forever, probably even for long. But sometimes we do have to do something about it,
Right.
to make a change.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing all of your hard-earned wisdom, and in being so vulnerable and open with your own story. I think people listening are really going to take away a lot from our conversation today. And I thank you for the really important work that you do.
Oh, thank you for what you do as well.
Thanks for sharing your time with me here on Prescribing Possibility. I hope today's conversation offered you a breath of fresh air, a new perspective, or even just a moment of calm in the chaos of life. If this episode resonated with you, pass it along to a friend or a colleague. You never know who might need a little more harmony in their life today. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, or topics you're curious about. Reach out to me anytime on Instagram or LinkedIn at dimpnawhile, or send me an email at podcast@dimpnawhile.com. Until next time, give yourself the grace to grow, the space to rest, and the courage to imagine what's next.